When I walked out that Saturday morning to water my tomatoes, the last thing I expected to see was my neighbor Karen crouched like a thief in broad daylight, her floral sun hat barely hiding the bright green hose snaking from my outdoor tap to her side of the fence. Water gushed freely, splattering onto her roses, her sandals, and her smug little face as she turned and said without even a hint of shame, "Oh, don't mind me, I'm just borrowing a little." For 10 solid seconds I stood there frozen between disbelief and laughter, because who in their right mind thinks connecting their hose to someone else's tap is normal? She looked so calm, so utterly confident in her madness, like this was the most natural thing in the world. That was the moment I realized something dangerous about Karen. She didn't think rules applied to her. Not social, not moral, not even hydraulic. I tried reason first, because that's what decent people do. "Karen," I said slowly, "you're using my water." She rolled her eyes like I was the unreasonable one. "It's just water," she replied. "We're neighbors. Community resources, right?" I blinked. Community resources? Since when was my water meter part of some socialist HOA experiment? I told her to disconnect it immediately, but she laughed and said, "Oh, don't be so uptight. It's not like you're running out." Then she turned back to her flowers, humming like she was the queen of suburbia and I was some pesky peasant disturbing her royal gardening. I walked away that day biting my tongue, but inside, a tiny fuse lit somewhere deep in my chest. Later that evening, as I reviewed my water bill online, I realized it had spiked nearly 20% in the last 2 months. 2 months. That's when Karen's lawn started looking like a golf course while the rest of the streets grass-browned under the summer heat. I had dismissed it as coincidence, but now I knew. She'd probably been siphoning off my tap for weeks, maybe longer. The thought made my hands clench around the mouse. I imagined her out there early mornings, sneaking over, twisting my valve open like she owned it, then waltzing back home with her perfect little grin and greener-than-life hydrangeas. The next morning I set out earlier, before sunrise, to catch her in the act again. I parked my chair behind the blinds, coffee in hand, feeling ridiculous but determined. Sure enough, at exactly 6:30 a.m., her garden gate opened. She tiptoed across the yard, hose in hand, in a pink robe and fluffy slippers, humming the same smug tune. The audacity was almost beautiful. She bent down, attached the hose, turned the tap, and smiled as the water started flowing. I stepped outside casually, pretending to stretch. She jumped a little, but then had the nerve to wave. "Morning," she chirped like we were best friends sharing a joke. I decided not to confront her directly this time. I smiled back, said nothing, and walked inside. That's when the plans started forming. My friend Ray is a plumber. He's the kind of guy who laughs at problems before fixing them, usually in ways that would terrify most homeowners. I told him the story over coffee, and he nearly choked laughing. "She's stealing your water? That's next-level Karen right there." He thought for a second, then said, "You want revenge or resolution?" I asked if both were possible. He grinned. "Always." He explained how easy it was to modify an exterior line. Just a pressure valve tweak, maybe a redirect or a hidden splitter. I didn't fully understand the mechanics, but I understood the potential. "You could, theoretically," he said, lowering his voice, "turn that tap into a geyser." The image stuck in my head like a devilish cartoon bubble. For now, though, I decided to observe. Over the next week, I tracked every time she used the tap. Morning, evening, even midday while I was at work. She'd sneak over, hook up her hose, and pretend nothing happened. I saw her filling kiddie pools, washing her car, even spraying down her driveway with my water. The gall. One afternoon she actually caught me watching from the window and waved again. "You really should water your own lawn more," she said sweetly. I had to bite my lip to stop from laughing out loud. By the weekend, the neighborhood grapevine had started buzzing. Apparently Karen had been bragging to the HOA about how she kept her garden pristine, without wasting money on overuse. Some neighbors even complimented her methods. She played the role of eco-warrior, claiming she used efficient techniques and timed watering. I knew better. Every time she smiled and gave me that smug look over the fence, it felt like she was daring me to say something, to make a scene. She wanted that power, that control, that public image of being right while I looked petty. So I played along. The next time I saw her connecting the hose, I didn't shout. I just smiled, waved, and said, "Enjoy your watering, Karen." That unsettled her a bit. She frowned, suspicious. "You're not mad anymore?" she asked. "No," I said with a grin. "I've learned to go with the flow." She laughed awkwardly, not realizing the double meaning. As she turned back to her flowers, I could almost feel the gears turning in her head. She thought she'd won. But as I stood there, I decided something quietly yet firmly. She had made a mockery of my patience, and it was time to shift the balance. My revenge wouldn't be impulsive or angry. It would be poetic, precise, and absolutely unforgettable. I wanted her to feel that moment when smug certainty turns into sheer panic, when you realize you've underestimated the wrong person. I imagined the look on her face when her harmless borrowing turned into a full-blown disaster, something so memorable she'd never touch another tap again. That night I pulled out my old notebook, scribbled ideas, and called Ray. We spent an hour sketching possibilities over video call, pressure adjustments, hidden valves, timing switches. It was part engineering, part art. I'd never felt so motivated over something so petty, but that's the thing about people like Karen. They awaken a creative madness in you. By midnight, I had the blueprint for a plan that would change our neighborly dynamics forever. As I looked out the window one last time before bed, I saw her patio lights still on. She was probably admiring her perfect, stolen water garden. I smiled faintly, whispering to myself, "Enjoy it while it lasts." Because the next time she turned that tap, it wouldn't be water trickling through. It would be the beginning of a storm she would never forget. The morning after I finalized the plan with Ray felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of morning where even the birds seemed to sense something brewing. I stood in my backyard pretending to sip coffee while watching Karen fuss over her flower beds across the fence. She had her hose hooked up to her own tap this time, maybe to appear innocent in case I was watching. But I knew her pattern well now. She was a creature of habit, and the moment she thought my attention drifted elsewhere, she'd sneak back to her favorite water source, mine. I had spent the previous night crawling around in the dirt like a secret agent, adjusting the outdoor tap's fittings under the dim glow of my porch light. Ray had guided me through every step on a video call, laughing the whole time as I whispered curses at spiders and stubborn bolt. By the time I finished, my system looked untouched from the outside, but inside it was wired for poetic justice. With a single twist of a hidden valve near the main line, I could redirect the pressure, magnifying it tenfold for a glorious few seconds before it cut off automatically. Enough to make a point without flooding the entire neighborhood. For now I wanted her to feel safe, complacent, unaware of what was coming. So, I gave her the illusion of peace. When I saw her that afternoon, I waved and even complimented her hydrangeas. Her guard dropped instantly. "Thank you," she said with exaggerated warmth. "I guess a little consistency pays off." I had to bite back a grin. "It sure does," I replied. As she turned back toward her porch, I noticed a new hose coiled near her fence. Bright yellow, new, and longer than before. She was preparing for another connection attempt. That told me two things. She was still addicted to my tap, and she was planning something bigger. That evening, I made sure to leave for a drive at my usual watering time, around 6:30. I parked 2 streets away, circled back quietly on foot, and crouched behind the hedge that separated our backyards. There she was, right on schedule, the criminal queen of cul-de-sac hydration, slipping the hose through a narrow gap in the fence. She attached it, twisted the tap, and the water flowed with that smug little sigh she always made. The sight should have angered me, but instead, I felt an odd kind of excitement, like I was watching the first scene of a well-rehearsed play unfold exactly as scripted. But fate, as it often does, decided to stir the pot. Two of our neighbors, Bill and Sandra, happened to be walking their dog nearby. Bill, a retired firefighter with a permanent frown, noticed Karen's hose setup immediately. "Hey, isn't that your water line she's using?" he asked me when I stood up casually. Karen froze mid-spray, her hand trembling just slightly. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she said, laughing nervously. "We have an understanding." I smiled politely. "Do we?" I asked. Bill raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the tension. "Well, that's a new kind of understanding. Maybe I should ask my neighbor for free electricity too." Karen turned red, muttered something about community sharing, and stomped back toward her fence. Bill chuckled. "You've got patience, I'll give you that," he said. "If she tried that with me, I'd cut her hose in half." I smiled, replying, "Let's just say I have my ways." Over the next few days, Karen avoided me completely. She watered only from her side, no trespassing, no hose swapping, just quiet distance. I might have believed she'd learned her lesson if not for the faint wet patch that appeared near my tap one morning. Someone had clearly reconnected and disconnected the hose in a hurry. She'd gotten sneakier, timing her thefts when I wasn't home. That confirmed it, her nerve hadn't cracked, it had evolved. I almost admired it. So, I started keeping a log. Every time I left, I noted the meter reading. Every time I came back, I checked again. The difference told the story. She was still stealing water, just in smaller doses to avoid suspicion. She probably thought she was clever. She probably thought she was winning. But she had no idea that every sneaky refill brought her closer to the moment I'd been crafting since that first stolen spray. Meanwhile, the neighborhood gossip machine spun faster than ever. Sandra, bless her chatty soul, had told everyone about the water drama. Soon, I was getting sympathetic smiles from half the block and smirks from the other half who seemed to think it was hilarious. One afternoon, at the mailbox, old Mrs. Jenkins said, "I hope you gave that woman a piece of your mind." I smiled, "Not yet, Mrs. Jenkins. I'm saving it for the right time." Karen, hearing this from across the street, glared daggers my way but said nothing. Her silence told me she was planning something too. And sure enough, by that weekend she struck again, bolder than ever. It was Sunday morning. I was having breakfast when I heard an unusual noise from outside, a rhythmic tapping followed by a hiss. I stepped out to see that she had installed some sort of dual hose connector on my tap. Not only was she stealing water again, she'd actually improved her system, connecting both her hose and mine to a metal splitter she'd clearly bought online. She'd even tightened it with a wrench, as if making it look official would somehow make it legal. I stared at the setup, half in disbelief, half in awe at her delusion. She turned, spotted me, and waved her wrench. "Oh, don't freak out," she said casually. "I bought this so we can both use it. Fair solution." My jaw clenched. "You bought it with my water bill money, didn't you?" I said quietly. She blinked, then huffed. "Don't be dramatic. It's just water. You men always make a fuss over little things." That last sentence did it. There was something about her tone, condescending, dismissive, that flipped a switch in my brain. I smiled faintly and said, "You're right, Karen. It's just water." That evening, I called Ray again and told him it was time. "You sure?" he asked, laughing. "Because once you do this, there's no going back to polite hellos." I grinned. "I'm counting on that." He guided me through one last adjustment, a hidden shut-off valve under the deck that would allow me to build pressure in the line before releasing it. I spent hours making sure everything was secure, precise, and reversible. I wasn't trying to destroy her garden, just her ego. When I finished, I tested the line once. It hissed like a coiled snake ready to strike. Perfect. For 2 days, I waited. Karen stayed unusually quiet, probably basking in the satisfaction of her new splitter system. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, she hosted what she called her summer garden showcase. I saw the invitations she'd handed out to neighbors. cheap printed cards with little watering cans on them. She wanted to show off her roses, her eco-friendly methods, and her precious community spirit. It was poetic, really. The stage was set, the audience assembled, and the water thief was about to steal her final drop. The moment arrived just before sunset. She stood proudly by her garden, guests milling about with lemonade glasses, laughing and admiring her work. I watched from my porch, pretending to read while my hand hovered near the hidden valve. She strutted to my tap, connected her hose with a smirk, and turned it. The line tensed instantly. I gave it 10 seconds, just like Ray advised, and then twisted my valve open. The hissing turned to a deep rumble. Karen frowned, confused, as her hose began trembling in her hand like a living thing. Then came the eruption. Water shot out with the force of a small cannon, blasting straight upward before whipping sideways into her face. The hose flailed wildly, soaking her dress, her guests, and half her prize-winning roses in a spinning storm of chaos. People screamed, laughed, and ducked as Karen wrestled the rogue serpent. I sat back, expression calm, heart racing. 10 seconds later, the line automatically shut off, leaving a drenched Karen standing in stunned silence, mascara streaking, dress plastered to her legs. The neighbors' laughter echoed across the yards. Karen turned toward me, sputtering, "What did you do?" I raised my coffee mug and said, "Just sharing a little pressure." The look she gave me could have peeled paint, but she didn't say another word. She stomped back inside, leaving her hose hissing weakly in the dirt. I leaned back, watching the sunset glint off the wet grass, and thought, that was only round one. The best part of any performance, after all, is the encore, and something told me Karen's next move would make it even more entertaining. For the next 2 days after the Geyser incident, the neighborhood couldn't stop buzzing. Everywhere I went, there was laughter and whispers. The story had spread faster than water from that hose, and I didn't even have to tell it. Mrs. Jenkins retold it at her morning tea with embellishments, claiming the spray had hit Karen's dog and turned it into a muddy streak running down the street. Bill added his version, saying he thought it was divine punishment for tap theft. Even the mailman gave me a knowing grin when he dropped off my letters. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I just smiled like a man who'd finally found peace after months of nonsense. But peace wasn't something Karen was willing to grant. She had gone dark since the Geyser, no morning appearances, no watering routines, no smug smiles over the fence. It was quiet, too quiet, and that made me nervous. I knew her type. People like her never accepted defeat gracefully. They simmered, planned, and waited for a chance to reclaim their power. That chance came sooner than I expected. On the 3rd morning after the eruption, I heard a sharp knock at my door. When I opened it, there stood a man in an HOA polo shirt, clipboard in hand, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Behind him, half hidden by her sunglasses and fake politeness, was Karen. "Good morning," the man began. "We received a complaint about unsafe plumbing modifications on your property." I almost laughed out loud. "Unsafe plumbing modifications?" I repeated, glancing at her. She crossed her arms. "Yes," she said smoothly, "your tap malfunctioned and sprayed across property lines, causing damage to my garden and personal distress. The HOA needs to ensure community water connections meet safety standards." The man looked uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other. I could tell he didn't want to be there. "We just need to take a quick look at your outdoor faucet," he mumbled. I smiled, motioned toward the backyard, and led the way. I could see Karen's smug expression growing as she followed us. She clearly thought she had me cornered, that she'd turn my revenge into punishment. The inspector crouched down by the tap, inspected the fittings, took a few notes, and frowned. "Everything looks standard here," he said finally. Karen blinked. "What? That can't be right." He shrugged. "Pressure's normal. No tampering I can see." I fought the urge to smirk. She stepped forward, pointing. "But it exploded. It drenched me, it's dangerous." The inspector straightened, giving her the tired look of a man who had seen too many neighborhood squabbles. "Ma'am, unless he installed a fire hydrant, I don't think a normal garden tap can explode on its own." He turned to me. "Sir, maybe you just had a surge. Happens sometimes." I nodded politely. "Yes, maybe it was a surge. Unpredictable weather, right?" The man smiled faintly, scribbled something, and left. Karen stood there fuming, unable to decide whether to scream or cry. Finally she hissed, "You think this is over?" and stormed off. I knew then that it was far from over. That night I noticed movement through my window. A shadow lingered near my fence, followed by a faint metallic sound, the clinking of tools. I stepped out quietly and caught Karen halfway through installing a security camera facing directly at my backyard. When she saw me, she froze like a kid caught stealing cookies. "You're trespassing," I said calmly. She straightened, trying to look dignified. "I'm documenting evidence. For legal purposes." I blinked. "Legal purposes? On my property?" She hesitated. "The fence line is community boundary," she argued. I sighed, tired but amused. "Then I'll be sure to decorate our community boundary tomorrow," I said, turning back toward my door. Her voice cracked as she yelled after me, "You can't intimidate me. I'm documenting everything." I didn't respond, but I did spend the next morning installing a tall trellis covered in thick ivy right in front of her camera. By noon, her expensive lens had nothing to record but green leaves dancing in the wind. A few days passed quietly after that, though I could feel her energy bubbling like carbonated anger beneath the surface. Then, one afternoon, I came home to find my driveway covered in wet dirt. It looked like someone had tried to dump garden soil and then spray it away. I followed the trail to the side fence and found a familiar hose lying in the grass. Karen's hose, unmistakably hers, with its bright yellow stripe. She had apparently tried to rinse away something, but the pressure wasn't enough, and the result was a muddy mess that spread onto both properties. I didn't need to think twice. I picked up her hose, coiled it neatly, and hung it on her mailbox. A quiet message, polite yet sharp. The next morning, it was gone, and so was the smugness in her face when she drove by. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. But her glare lingered long enough to confirm I'd hit a nerve. Then came the unexpected twist. That weekend, while mowing my lawn, I overheard Karen chatting with another neighbor, Melissa. She was spinning a new narrative, claiming I'd tampered with her property, that I was obsessed with her garden, and that I had engineered the water incident to humiliate her. Melissa, ever the gossip, listened wide-eyed, feeding on every exaggerated detail. I wanted to laugh, but the absurdity of it annoyed me. So I decided to turn her own strategy against her. That evening, I printed out photos I'd taken of her connecting the hose, timestamps and all, and placed them in an envelope labeled "For HOA Documentation." I didn't actually deliver it to the HOA. Instead, I left it conspicuously in my mailbox while Karen was walking her dog. She saw it. Her face went pale, then red. The power of suggestion did the rest. By the next day, I could see her whispering nervously to Melissa, and by evening, she had disconnected all her hoses and moved her potted plants away from the fence. The battle of nerves was turning in my favor. But, as always, Karen couldn't let things end quietly. On Tuesday morning, I stepped outside to find a note taped to my front door in neat cursive handwriting. "You have 1 week to fix your plumbing issue and formally apologize for harassment, or I'll escalate legally. Karen." I read it twice and laughed out loud. Legal escalation over water theft. What a concept. Instead of replying, I decided to raise the stakes differently. That night, I set up a small motion-activated sprinkler system facing my side of the fence. Not to hit her, just enough to mist the air whenever movement was detected. It was harmless, subtle, and completely within my property. But when she came snooping again around midnight, probably to collect evidence, the sprinklers hissed to life. Her startled yelp echoed down the street. I peeked from my window just in time to see her retreating in soaked pajamas, clutching her phone. I smiled, not because it was childish fun, but because every action she took now only reinforced her own reputation as the neighborhood lunatic. The next morning, she avoided everyone. But the neighborhood's patience had reached its limit. Sandra caught her yelling at the mailman and called Bill over. Within an hour, half the block was discussing her antic. By evening, someone had placed a little garden gnome holding a "No Free Water" sign at the end of her driveway. It wasn't me, but I wished I'd thought of it. The gnome stayed there for 2 days before disappearing mysteriously, but by then the message had spread. Karen was becoming the punchline of every casual conversation. And yet, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because beneath all her arrogance, I could tell she was unraveling. Her garden, once immaculate, began to look neglected. The flowers drooped, the lawn yellowed, and her prized hydrangeas wilted. Whether out of embarrassment or defiance, she'd stopped using my water, and apparently her own too. One evening, I saw her staring at her yard from her porch, arms crossed, lips tight, the queen dethroned. For a brief moment, I wondered if maybe she'd finally learned her lesson. But then, as I turned to go inside, she shouted, "Enjoy your little victory, but remember, pressure can burst both ways." It was cryptic, but I understood the warning. Karen wasn't finished. That night, I found myself unable to sleep. I lay there, listening to the distant creaks of the neighborhood, the hum of air conditioners, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of running water. I got up, stepped outside, and froze. My outdoor tap was on, full force, flooding the grass. Someone had turned it deliberately. The hose wasn't attached, so the water simply sprayed into the night air, glistening under the porch light. I walked slowly toward it, shut it off, and stared at the handle. My pulse thudded in my ears. She'd been here again. It wasn't about water anymore, it was about control, a silent tug-of-war played out through a faucet. I stood there in the cool night breeze, realizing this wasn't just neighborhood pettiness anymore. It had become personal, and as much as I hated to admit it, I was now just as drawn into the game as she was. By the time a week had passed since the flooded night, I had learned that peace in our neighborhood was just an illusion, a fragile skin stretched over constant chaos. Karen's obsession had evolved into something stranger, quieter, and far more unsettling. She no longer confronted me directly, no more notes or HOA threats, but she watched. I could feel her eyes through the slats of the fence, sense her presence whenever I stepped outside. Sometimes I'd hear the faint click of a phone camera or see her curtains shift as I mowed the lawn. It was less about water now and more about pride, about her need to prove she could still win. The irony was that she didn't realize how much she was losing. Her lawn was dying, her flowers limp, her perfect image slipping away like sand through clenched fists. But for someone like Karen, the truth never mattered as much as perception. And if she couldn't fix her garden, she would try to fix her reputation instead. I first realized that when the HOA newsletter came out that Friday. There, buried between notices about pet waste and parking violations, was a section titled Community Cooperation and Water Use Ethics, featuring a suspiciously familiar story about neighbors who tamper with plumbing and cause property damage. The writing was passive-aggressive enough to scream Karen's tone. She'd managed to slip her narrative into print, using her connections to smear me without naming names. It was clever, in a petty kind of way. I could have ignored it, but I decided to respond the only way that truly mattered, through result. If she wanted to turn this into a war of reputation, I'd make sure the entire neighborhood saw exactly who she really was, without me saying a single word. That weekend, I called Ray again, this time for something a little more theatrical. I told him about the newsletter, about the nightly sabotage, about the eerie sense of being watched. He laughed for a full minute before saying, "You want to end this once and for all? Let's make it a show she'll never forget." His plan was simple but brilliant. We would set up a fake irrigation testing day. I'd post flyers around the neighborhood announcing that the water department was checking pressure fluctuations on residential tap. Anyone who tampered with external valves during testing could face fines for interference. Of course, there was no real water department visit, but Karen didn't need to know that. The beauty of the idea was in how predictable she was. If she believed her tap use might get me in trouble, she wouldn't be able to resist meddling. And that's when my real system, an upgraded version of the Geyser trap, would come into play. For 2 days I prepared the yard, cleaned the valve system, and installed a small motion sensor to trigger the pressure boost. This time it wasn't manual. The moment her hand touched the tap, the sensor would detect movement and unleash the full force for exactly 6 seconds before shutting off. It wouldn't cause any damage, but it would be dramatic enough to ensure witnesses. I even placed one of my old outdoor cameras on the shed roof, pointed straight at the tap. Every step felt methodical, satisfying, like arranging chess pieces for the inevitable checkmate. Meanwhile, Karen kept pretending she was uninvolved, smiling too sweetly when she saw me at the mailbox, complimenting my shirt, even offering a jar of homemade pickles as some absurd peace offering. I accepted it with a straight face but didn't touch it. It wasn't reconciliation. It was reconnaissance. She was trying to gauge whether I was lowering my guard. By Sunday morning, everything was in place. The flyers I'd printed looked official enough to fool anyone. Bold fonts, water department logo from Google Images, the whole deal. I taped one near the community board, another by the mailboxes, and one right on my own fence. By evening, the gossip had spread. Bill even stopped by to ask if it was true. I played innocent, saying, "Apparently they're testing for illegal pressure valves. I hope nobody's been tinkering." He laughed and said, "If they find Karen, I'll buy you dinner." That was the moment I knew word had reached her. The next morning dawned bright and tense. I worked from home that day, pretending to type emails while watching the side yard through the window. Hours passed. Noon came and went. Then, just after 2 o'clock, I saw her patio door open. She was dressed in her gardening outfit, big hat, gloves, and determination painted across her face. She looked both nervous and defiant, the kind of person who knew they shouldn't do something but couldn't help themselves. She crossed the lawn, glanced around to make sure no one was watching, and slipped through the gap in the fence. My heart raced even though I'd been expecting it. She reached for the tap. The sensor clicked, and within a heartbeat, the geyser roared to life. The jet of water exploded upward, hitting the underside of her hat and sending it flying like a frisbee into her yard. She screamed, stumbling backward as the spray drenched her head to toe. The pressure caught her hose connector too, flinging it into the air where it whipped around like a wild snake, soaking everything within range. I heard laughter before I even opened my door. Neighbors had seen it from their windows, and one of them, probably Sandra, was already filming. I walked out calmly, holding my phone, pretending to look surprised. "Karen? Are you all right?" I called out. She sputtered, mascara running, eyes wide with fury and humiliation. "You set me up," she shrieked. "You're insane." I shrugged. "You were warned about the testing. Maybe the system's just sensitive." By the time she retreated, soaked and screaming, half the block had gathered. Bill shouted something about calling the Discovery Channel for nature's dumbest moments. The laughter echoed long after she slammed her door. I stood there soaking in the satisfaction, not because I'd embarrassed her, but because it had ended publicly and undeniably. There was no way she could twist this into another story of victimhood. She had literally been caught red-handed and rain-soaked. The footage from Sandra's phone circulated quickly through the neighborhood group chat. By evening, someone had turned it into a short meme titled "Hydration Station, Karen Edition." I thought that would be the end of it. I genuinely did. For 2 blissful days there was silence. No cameras, no notes, no snooping. I even started relaxing again, tending my own plants without looking over my shoulder. But on the 3rd night, something strange happened. Around midnight, the motion light outside flickered on. I looked through the blinds and saw a shape moving near the fence, small, hunched, sneaky. I assumed it was Karen, back for round 3. I slipped out quietly, flashlight in hand, and crept around the corner. But it wasn't Karen. It was a teenager, one of the local kids, kneeling near the tap, probably curious after all the excitement. He jumped when he saw me, muttered an apology, and ran off. Relief washed over me, but when I glanced toward Karen's yard, I saw her window curtain flutter. She'd been watching the whole thing. The thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I found a small package on my porch. No note, just a neatly wrapped box. Inside was a cheap plastic water gun filled with blue food coloring and a little tag that read, "Thought you might like to play fair." I stood there for a minute, the absurdity of it sinking in. It wasn't even threatening anymore, it was desperate. She was running out of moves, reduced to childish pranks. I tossed it in the trash and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. But later that day, when I checked my camera feed, I noticed something new. There were faint noises recorded during the night, muffled laughter, footsteps, and a soft hiss of running water. I rewound the footage and saw it clearly. A trickle of water seeping from the tap around 1 a.m., then stopping abruptly. She'd come back again. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep playing defense. As satisfying as the revenge had been, the cycle wouldn't stop until I ended it completely. So I started planning something final, not cruel, not humiliating, but decisive. I would make her see the futility of this war. Ray helped me design one last trick, a harmless but symbolic gesture that would make its point. We built a small system connected to the outdoor tap that released biodegradable blue dye through the water whenever activated. If she tried to use my tap again, the dye would instantly stain her hands and clothes for a day or two, nothing dangerous, just unmistakable. It was poetic justice. That night, as I tightened the final fitting, the moon glowed faintly over the rooftops, casting silver light across the damp lawns. The neighborhood slept, unaware of the quiet endgame unfolding between two stubborn people separated by a fence. I turned off the light, looked at my handiwork, and whispered to the dark, "Let's see who gets the last drop." The next morning started off calm, deceptively calm, the kind of morning where you almost believe the storm has passed and you're free at last from all the nonsense. The air smelled clean, the sun stretched lazily across the fences, and even the birds seemed to be singing without sarcasm for once. I stepped onto my porch with coffee in hand, scanning Karen's yard like I always did, expecting her curtains to twitch or her door to creak open. But nothing moved. Her lawn looked worse than ever, yellow patches spreading like bruises across her once proud carpet of green. Her flower beds drooped in surrender. For a brief, peaceful moment I thought maybe she'd given up, maybe she'd finally accepted that her empire of entitlement had fallen. I should have known better. People like Karen don't surrender. They plot in silence, waiting for the right time to strike again. And that strike came sooner than I imagined. Around noon, as I was tightening the hinges on the backyard gate, I heard the faint sound of a hose being dragged. It wasn't my imagination. The rhythmic hiss of water soon followed, soft but unmistakable, the kind of sound that instantly made my jaw tighten. I peered through a gap in the fence, and there she was, crouched by the tap, wearing gloves this time like she was preparing for battle. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. She looked cautious, her head darting around like a thief checking for guards. Her hand hesitated on the tap handle, and for a brief second I saw the flicker of doubt cross her face. Maybe she remembered the geyser, the laughter, the humiliation. But pride won, as it always does with her kind. She twisted the handle. The line hissed once, then erupted, not in a violent burst this time, but in a glorious fountain of bright blue water that splashed across her arms, soaked her sleeves, and painted her gloves in glowing color. She gasped, stumbled back, and looked at her hands in horror. The dye was working perfectly, vivid and unmistakable. I couldn't help the smile that spread across my face. She scrambled to turn off the tap, but every move only made it worse. The blue spread up her wrists, staining her skin like ink on paper. When she realized it wouldn't come off, She let out a strangled shriek that echoed down the street. By the time I walked out casually onto the porch, a few neighbors had already noticed. Sandra was out walking her dog, and when she saw Karen flailing around covered in blue water, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Oh my goodness, what happened to you?" she called out. Karen froze, her eyes wide, her expression somewhere between rage and humiliation. "Chemical sabotage," she screamed, pointing at me. "He's poisoning my property." I nearly choked on my laughter but kept my face straight. "Karen," I said calmly, "you're the one who touched my tap again, weren't you? There's a notice about water testing, remember?" She glared at me, shaking with fury. "You think this is funny? I could sue you." I took a slow sip of my coffee and said, "You can try, but make sure you explain to the judge why you were on my property at noon." Her jaw opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Sandra was biting her lip to keep from laughing. The moment stretched like elastic until Karen spun around and stormed back to her house, dripping blue footprints all the way. That should have been the end of it, but nothing with Karen ever ends neatly. That afternoon, a black sedan rolled into her driveway. Out stepped a man in a suit, clipboard in hand, the same HOA inspector from before. I watched from my porch as Karen dragged him toward my fence, waving her stained arms as evidence. Look at this. He's weaponized plumbing." The man looked exhausted before she even finished her sentence. "Ma'am," he said, "I can't do anything if he's within his property line." She hissed back, "Then make new rules." He sighed, took a few photos, and left. She stood there alone afterward, trembling with anger, and I could almost see the gears turning in her mind. She was humiliated again, this time in daylight, in front of witnesses, and it had been her own doing. I almost pitied her. Almost. The neighborhood, however, didn't pity her at all. By evening, the memes were back. Someone, probably Bill, had taken a screenshot from Sandra's video and added the caption, "Avatar, the water thief." It circulated in the community chat faster than lightning. Karen must have seen it because her lights went out early that night, and her blinds stayed shut for 2 full days. For once, her yard was silent, her driveway empty, her mailbox untouched. It was eerie, like the calm after an explosion when you can still smell the smoke but can't see the flames. I didn't trust it. I knew she was planning something behind those closed curtains. On the 3rd day, my suspicion proved right. I woke up to the sound of banging, metal against metal, sharp and steady. When I stepped outside, I saw her hammering something onto her fence. It was a large sign that read, "Trespassers will be reported and prosecuted." The irony was so thick I could have bottled it. I watched her work, her arms still faintly blue despite the glove. When she noticed me watching, she shouted, "You stay on your side and I'll stay on mine." I smiled. "That's all I ever wanted, Karen." But she wasn't done. That evening, she parked her car directly in front of my mailbox, blocking it entirely, an act of petty defiance that screamed desperation. I took a photo, filed a quick complaint online, and within hours a patrol car stopped by to ask her to move it. When she refused, they towed it. The look on her face as her car disappeared down the street was something I'd remember for a long, satisfying time. But it was what happened next that truly sealed the end of our Cold War. The following morning, I got a call from Ray, laughing so hard he could barely talk. "You're not gonna believe this," he said. "Apparently Karen called a plumber to inspect her line because she thought your water dye had infected her system. The guy drained her hose connections and found a frog nest inside. A real one. She's been using frog water." I nearly dropped my phone laughing. The poetic justice was beyond anything I could have planned. She had spent weeks stealing water, tormenting me, and in the end, she'd been watering her precious flowers with swamp brew. The neighborhood found out soon after, of course. Sandra couldn't resist sharing the story, and by evening, even the HOA group chat was full of frog emojis. Karen stopped coming outside altogether after that. Her car stayed parked awkwardly in her driveway, her garden withered completely, and the once immaculate patio furniture was now gathering dust. I walked by one evening just to check the damage. Through her window, I saw her sitting on her couch staring blankly at the TV, curtains half closed, her shoulders slumped. The queen of control, dethroned at last by her own greed and stubbornness. In a strange way, I didn't feel triumphant anymore. I just felt relieved. It wasn't about winning anymore, it was about reclaiming peace. I walked back to my yard, turned on my tap, and watched clear water flow without interference, without conflict. For the first time in months it was just water. Simple, clean, and mine. I thought that might be the perfect ending, but life loves one last twist. A week later, as I was pruning the hedges, a delivery truck pulled up outside Karen's house. A new family was moving in. Karen had sold the place. I watched as movers carried boxes marked "Fragile" and "Kitchen," while a young couple chatted cheerfully beside them. No sign of Karen anywhere. By afternoon, the new neighbors came over to introduce themselves. They were polite, kind, normal, the kind of people who didn't seem likely to wage war over a hose. I welcomed them warmly, offered lemonade, and they laughed when I joked about unwritten neighborhood rules about water sharing. They didn't know the story yet, but they would. The street always remembers. That night, I stood on my porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fences in orange light. The garden smelled sweet again. My tomatoes glowed red under the fading sun. Somewhere, a sprinkler hissed softly in the distance, steady and peaceful. I thought about Karen, wherever she was now, probably trying to explain to some new unfortunate neighbor why her hands still looked faintly blue. The thought made me chuckle. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely at peace, no schemes, no anger, just quiet satisfaction. The war of water was over, and the victory didn't come from revenge. It came from surviving the chaos with my sanity intact. I took one last look at the tap, the humble source of all this madness, and muttered to myself with a tired grin, all that over a few gallons of water. Then I turned it off, went inside, and finally, blissfully, let the silence wash over me. Several months passed after Karen moved out, and the neighborhood seemed to breathe again, as if some invisible weight had finally been lifted. The street felt lighter, quieter, almost like everyone had silently agreed to forget the chaos she had caused. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could enjoy my mornings without checking my tap or looking over the fence. The new neighbors, the Parkers, turned out to be genuinely kind people. They waved when they saw me, kept their yard tidy, and never once borrowed anything without asking. It was almost too normal, and that normalcy felt like a luxury. My garden flourished again, the tomatoes came back stronger than ever, and the sound of my sprinkler in the evenings became the comforting rhythm of peace restored. I thought the whole chapter of Karen and her water wars had finally ended. But sometimes life doesn't close doors quietly. It leaves them slightly ajar, just enough for echoes of the past to slip through. And that echo arrived one breezy afternoon when I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, just my name written in sharp, deliberate handwriting I recognized instantly. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. Inside was a single folded letter, and as soon as I unfolded it, a faint whiff of perfume hit me, the same overly floral scent Karen always wore. The letter read, "I hope you're enjoying your victory. I've learned a lot since leaving that neighborhood. I'm living by the lake now, and my new garden is thriving. It's amazing what happens when people respect each other's resources. I'm sure you'll be glad to know I found a more appreciative community. Some lessons take pressure to learn. Yours truly, Karen." I stood there reading it twice, trying to decipher the tone. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it wasn't pure hostility either. It was Karen in her truest form, a mix of pride, denial, and half-acknowledgement wrapped in passive aggression. I chuckled softly, shook my head, and tucked the letter into a drawer. It didn't bother me. If anything, it felt like closure, like the final ripple after a long storm. As weeks went by, her name faded into the background noise of old neighborhood gossip. People occasionally mentioned her when sharing funny stories about past neighbors, but mostly she became a legend, a cautionary tale about boundary lines and hose etiquette. I found a strange satisfaction in that. The whole ordeal, as ridiculous as it had been, taught me more than I expected. It wasn't just about standing up to entitlement, it was about learning patience, resilience, and the fine art of picking your battles. There were nights when I'd sit on my porch, watch the sprinklers mist across my lawn, and wonder how something as simple as water could have caused such chaos. It was almost poetic, the way a tap had turned into a symbol of control, pride, and revenge. One day, while chatting with the Parkers, they mentioned seeing a moving truck near the lake community about 30 minutes away. "You won't believe this," Mr. Parker said, laughing, "but we met a woman there named Karen. She told us she used to live in this neighborhood. Said she left because of a water dispute." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. "Oh, that must have been quite a story," I said, trying to sound neutral. "What did she say?" Mrs. Parker grinned. "She said her neighbor was obsessed with control and tried to flood her garden as revenge." I smiled, shaking my head. She always did have a creative memory. The Parkers laughed, and that was that. For a moment, I felt a flicker of curiosity about what her new life looked like, whether she really had changed or was repeating her same mistakes with someone else. But then I realized it didn't matter. I had my peace, and that was more valuable than any revenge could ever be. That summer, our street held a neighborhood barbecue, the first one in years where everyone showed up and no one argued. Kids ran through sprinklers, adults chatted over grilled corn, and laughter filled the air without tension. At one point, Bill raised a glass and joked, "To fewer Karens and more calm." The whole street erupted in laughter. Even Mrs. Jenkins, who usually frowned at jokes, clinked her cup and said, "Amen to that." As the sun dipped low, I looked around and realized how much our little community had healed. The fences, once symbols of division, now looked like harmless decorations. The water taps glistened under the orange sky, innocent again. But peace has a funny way of reminding you of its fragility. One evening, late in autumn, I was walking along the lakeside park near the edge of town when I saw her again. Karen. She was standing by a flower bed near the community dock, hose in hand, watering a row of potted plants. Her back was to me, but the posture was unmistakable, rigid, confident, in control. For a moment I thought about walking away quietly, pretending I hadn't seen her. But then she turned. Her eyes met mine, and for a split second both of us froze, caught in that strange web of shared history. Then, to my surprise, she smiled. Not the smug grin I remembered, but a small, almost genuine smile. "Well," she said, her voice softer than before, "fancy seeing you near my new water source." I laughed before I could stop myself. "Don't worry," I said, "I'm just passing through. No hose wars this time." She smirked faintly. "I learned my lesson. I have my own tap now." There was an awkward pause, then she added, "Your plan was clever, by the way. I hated you for it, but I respect it now." That caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. Finally I replied, "You made it easy. You just kept pushing." She nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. "I know. I was angry at everyone back then. You just happened to be the one person who didn't fold." Her voice trailed off as she turned the hose off and coiled it neatly. I noticed her garden was smaller this time, neater, simpler, like she'd traded chaos for calm. "It looks nice," I said honestly. She gave a small, proud smile. "It's peaceful here," she said. "No HOA. Just the lake and the ducks." I nodded. "That's good. You needed peace." For a moment, we stood there in silence, two former enemies sharing a rare truce under the fading sunlight. Then she looked at me again and said, "You know, I used to think power meant getting my way. Now I think it's about knowing when to stop." I left her there by the dock, the sound of the hose fading behind me. As I walked back to my car, The air smelled faintly of water and earth, and I couldn't help but smile. It felt like closure, the real kind this time, not the smug satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet realization that even the most absurd conflicts eventually find their way to peace. That night, when I got home, I stood by my own tap again, the same one that had caused all the drama, and turned it on. The water flowed clear, steady, and calm, just like the world around me. I let it run for a moment, listening to the gentle hiss, thinking about everything that had happened, the laughter, the madness, the lessons hidden beneath it all. Then I turned it off and whispered to myself, pressure released. From that day forward, the story of Karen became a neighborhood legend, retold at barbecues and family gatherings, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes softened, but always ending with a laugh. People called it the Great Hose War, and every time someone new moved in, someone else would eventually bring it up with a grin. And me? I never corrected the details. I just listened, smiled, and watched the laughter ripple through the crowd. Because deep down I knew the truth wasn't about who won or lost. It was about what we all learned, that boundaries matter, pride can drown you faster than water, and sometimes the best revenge is letting things flow back to calm. Years later, when the tap finally rusted and I replaced it with a new one, I paused before throwing the old handle away. I kept it instead, hung it in my shed as a strange little trophy, not of victory, but of patience. Every time I saw it, I remembered the chaos, the laughter, the absurdity, and the satisfaction of surviving it all with humor intact. Karen's name eventually faded from the neighborhood vocabulary, replaced by new stories, new dramas, new faces. But sometimes, when I watered my garden on quiet summer evenings, I'd glance toward the fence and half expect to see her there again, arguing about something trivial, hose in hand, ready to stir things up. And then I'd laugh quietly to myself, grateful that all that pressure had finally turned into nothing more than a story we could all laugh about, a story that began with one entitled neighbor, one stubborn homeowner, and a tap that turned the whole neighborhood into a comedy of water and willpower.